Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers and guests. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this public panel on meritocracy, a topic that has been a source of much debate and controversy in recent years. This public panel on meritocracy is a special part and hopefully the highlight of the 10th Land Economics Conference entitled Land Economics of Justice, Efficiency, Reciprocity, Meritocracy that started yesterday at the University of Lucerne. Meritocracy is a system that rewards individuals based on their abilities and performance rather than their social background or connections. This means that everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, has an equal opportunity to succeed based on their talent and hard work. According to proponents of meritocracy, a meritocratic society can lead to greater social mobility. Individuals are able to rise up the social ladder based on their abilities and achievements rather than being constrained by their social background. This can help to break down barriers and promote greater equality, as individuals are not held back by their circumstances. In addition, it is said that meritocracy can also encourage innovation and creativity. By rewarding individuals based on their talent and hard work, meritocracy can encourage individuals to strive for excellence in their work. This leads to new ideas, inventions, and breakthroughs that are a benefit for the entire society. Furthermore, by valuing talent and ability over social background, meritocracy can help to create a more diverse and inclusive society. This can lead to a greater creativity as individuals from different backgrounds bring in unique perspectives and ideas. Overall, the benefits of meritocracy seem to be clear. It can promote greater social mobility, encourage innovation and creativity, and leads to a more diverse and inclusive society. Nonetheless, meritocracy has come under criticism in recent years. Perhaps the promises of meritocracy are a fairy tale. One of the main criticism is that meritocracy can perpetuate inequality rather than reduce it. In theory, it sounds good, but in a real society with already existing inequalities, it can be more difficult for individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds to access the opportunities they need to succeed. For example, individuals from low-income families may not have access to the same quality of education or resources as those from privileged backgrounds. Furthermore, some argue that meritocracy can lead to a culture of individualism where people focus only on their own success and do not work together. This can lead to a lack of cooperation and teamwork, and finally undermine solidarity in the entire society. In order to analyze and discuss these very relevant questions, I welcome the two speakers, David Miller from Oxford University and Melanie Hähner from the Institute for Swiss Economic Policy at the University of Lucerne. Unfortunately, James Hankins had to cancel his participation. Whereas David Miller will focus on the criticism of meritocracy in general, Melanie Hähner will present empirical evidence, especially on social mobility in Switzerland, with its famous dual education system and compare her findings with other countries. The panel will be moderated by Karl Hofstetter, titular professor of business and private law at the University of Zurich and a former member of the board of the University of Lucerne. Now I would like to give the floor to Karl Hofstetter to chair this public panel.
So welcome from my side to today's panel. I also welcome everybody from the outside. We opened up this panel for those who are interested, and we didn't just open it up physically, we also opened it up through YouTube. So this panel here will be broadcast on YouTube, and we'll see how this works out. So thank you, Klaus, for trying this out at this conference this year. As Klaus already said, meritocracy is really a big issue in connection with justice. I think we all feel that somehow it is just that if somebody who works more, takes more risks, performs better, also gets a bigger share and wins in the competition that we, to some extent, are all in our societies. But the question is, how do we make sure that we have meritocracy that works, that starts for everybody on an equal level? Are we able to do that by just treating everybody? And let me now see whether... Hello? Are we achieving meritocracy by treating everybody equally? Or do we need some kind of equity standards that make sure that we have a level playing field for everybody? And how do things work out in reality? Are we gonna have the most capable, perhaps even the most reckless, the most privileged who takes it all or almost all, with others being left behind? Does that also mean that perhaps, as Klaus mentioned, we should even forget about meritocracy or diminish its meaning in our societies because we can't make it work in real life? So these are the questions, some of the basic questions that we have. And I'd like to organize today's discussion in clusters of questions. And that's something we'll go into once we have heard our two speakers. The first cluster is really, is meritocracy justice at all? Is it a key justice concept that we should keep in our societies, that we should further develop in our market democracies or democratic market societies? And that's very important, has meritocracy really been internalized by people? I mean, we speak about this intellectually here, but have people really internalized that? What do empirical data say on that? I know that our speaker, David Miller, has done research on that. We'll probably hear part of his story there as well. Can meritocracy be just without equal opportunities and a level playing field, as was mentioned before? And then the big question is, to what extent do we have to make sure that we end up with a level playing field? So that's the first cluster of questions. Is meritocracy justice at all? And if yes, how? Then the second cluster of questions is really, how has meritocracy been implemented in society? In our societies, maybe it's not the same everywhere. Maybe it's different in the US than in Switzerland and the European countries. So we'll hear perhaps some of those comparisons today as well, since Melanie Hanner is going to particularly show data on how things are in Switzerland, whereas David Miller is coming, from a more international side, so to speak. And, there are many issues there without going into details right here, but we can do that during the debate. Income disparities, management salaries, big justice issue here in Switzerland that we have had 2 votes. You'll probably know about it or hear about that later on. The gender gap that we have in salaries. wealth concentration, another big issue. To what extent is, the concentration of wealth diminishing meritocracy? Thomas Piketty, for instance, was radical on that, saying, we should tax wealth very highly. We should tax inheritance and thereby, bring up or realize that kind of level playing field we just talked about. So maybe that's something to be talked about. But there's also another approach here, giving pledge. In the US, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, who also want to promote meritocracy by looking for voluntary solutions, saying that at the end of your life as a very wealthy person, you should at least give away part of your wealth to society, put it into foundations, which they're both doing as well. So this is the wealth concentration issue, the education issue, well known particularly in countries outside Switzerland, in Anglo-Saxon countries with elite institutions. Do those elite institutions undermine equal opportunities? To what extent? Whereas in Switzerland, we have the dual track field. Maybe that's another interesting contrast that we can go into today. And then, we have the influence of families and everything in terms of the cultural background, the educational background that you also get before you even go to school. So these are the things that play into all this too. Then we have perhaps as another a set of issues, the discrimination issue that we talk about everywhere right now, discrimination based on sex, gender, race, in connection with employment, in connection with whatever positions in society. So that's the second cluster. Do we really implement meritocracy if it's just in the first place? And then maybe a third very important cluster of issues. Are there values, social values, that are as important as justice and meritocracy that trump meritocracy? For instance, productivity. Should we sacrifice justice and meritocracy in order to make the pie for the whole society as large as possible? Does that... Let's look at what happened in Switzerland this week. Credit Suisse was bailed out by the Swiss National Bank with a loan of 50 or a facility of 50 billion Swiss francs. I think we all would agree, and that saves the jobs of managers and the board. I think we probably would all agree that the board and the managers don't really deserve that protection. On the other hand, we also agree that if Credit Suisse goes bust, that would really hurt Switzerland as an economy and everybody else. So maybe that justifies the injustice. That's a big issue, that those goal conflicts that society has. There are other issues here. Social cohesion, that's an argument Sandel, for instance, and others have brought up, that in order to save the dignity of everybody, we shouldn't exaggerate with meritocracy. Then there's a third approach here, or a third conflict that had particularly been developed by Hayek, saying, the most important is freedom, because don't go down the slippery slope of justice and also of meritocracy, because freedom is the one thing that will make our societies as productive as possible, as innovative as possible, and will bring progress to a much larger extent than if we bet on justice and meritocracy. So these are the three clusters that we want to discuss after the two introductory speakers. Now let me just bring in the speakers. As Klaus already mentioned, we have really not been lucky, and I would even say it's not just that Mr. Hankins, Professor Hankins from Harvard, has caught corona this week. His wife as well, and that's why he had to cancel on short notice. But nevertheless, I'm fortunate in that sense. I'm glad that Professor David Miller from Oxford made it, and I'm looking forward to his speak. Professor Miller has been at Oxford for many, many years. He teaches political theory. He is both, I understand, a philosopher and a political scientist, and he has written extensively on social justice. The book that sparked my interest at the time was Principles of Social Justice, where he also brings in a lot of empirical data, something that traditional social justice intellectuals did not do. I've seen it for the first time in his book. So I'm very glad to welcome Professor David Miller. I'd like to give him the floor.
Where's the? Oh, here. Yeah. Hi, everybody. How's the sound? Can you hear me at the back? It's good. Thank you. So I'd like to start by thanking the organisers, especially Klaus and Carl, for the opportunity to come and speak here. It's always a great pleasure to be back in Switzerland. I never refuse an invitation, however unusual, and I do feel a little bit of an interloper, since the main theme of our meeting has been law and economics. As Carl has just said, my own field is political philosophy, but I hope that what I have to say about meritocracy is of some interest to people here. I'm coming back to it after a time spent on other issues. I wrote about it in the book Principles of Social Justice that Carl mentioned, and I'm coming back to it partly because, as Klaus said, this has become a hotly contested issue, and the academic argument seems to be moving against meritocracy. So. Nope. Sorry. Oh, this one maybe? Right. Okay, I got it. Yeah. Okay. So here are, for example, 4 books written from different disciplinary backgrounds, all of them converging on the idea that meritocracy is fundamentally flawed. So, and these books are not just saying that we don't already have meritocracies in our societies. I mean, it's fairly easy to see that. That requires no great depth of analysis. They're claiming, in addition, that as an ideal, meritocracy is flawed. Its role, they claim, is ideological, not normative. Its role is to justify the inequalities that we see around us in capitalist societies. And so it ought to be just discarded as an idea. Now contrast this with politicians who queue up to announce that their aim is to give every child in their society the opportunity to rise as far as their talents will take them. So, here we go. Here, one of our many late prime ministers, I don't know how many back now it is, a few back, Theresa May. And now I think what's interesting, so here she proclaims that her ideal is to turn Britain into a meritocracy. And what's interesting is this could have been said equally by a centre-left politician. Tony Blair, for example, often spoke about meritocracy in similar terms. So again, I think these politicians are not saying we already have a meritocracy. What they are saying is that it should be the aim to create one. And that's what the academic critics are denying. Okay, so again, against that background, first we need to understand what meritocracy is, and there's some dispute about this. So I'm going to treat it as made up of 3 connected principles. So it's a fairly broad conception. First principle covers the way in which advantaged social positions, notably jobs, scarce educational opportunities, are allocated. They should go to those who can demonstrate that they have the qualities that best equip them to carry out the task involved in the position. That's the hiring by merit principle. Second is that social institutions, education system and so on, should be arranged in such a way that people have equal opportunities to acquire and develop the qualities that count as merit for the purposes of the first principle. And then the third is that the rewards that come from occupying social positions should be commensurate with the social value that the incumbents create. Now, I think it's important to see that these three principles, though they each have their own rationale and justification, work most strongly when combined. So they get justificatory strengths from their combination. And that's something I may want to come back to later. Because imagine a society in which each of these principles was fully realized, that would then be a society in which a person's life chances would depend entirely on their own efforts and talents, and so they would deserve all of the advantages that they receive. And I think that's the ideal that politicians like May are referring to when they say that meritocracy is a fundamentally fair way of organising society without necessarily believing that we already have one. Now, let me just add two elements of qualification here. First, I think the scope of meritocracy can vary in the sense that it can be applied to a narrower or wider range of social positions. So normally, when we talk about meritocracy, we think about school, university places, and then jobs in the formal economy. But the principle could also be applied to honours, prizes, positions in civil society. Some people even argue for political meritocracy, so-called China model. And I think there are going to be reasons for and against widening or narrowing the scope. So I'm going to leave that an open question as to how wide or narrow it should be. Now, second, notice that meritocracy, as I've defined it, contains a proportionality principle of proportionate reward for services, but it doesn't specify how large or how small those differences should be. So in other words, if Sheila, through her job, creates more social value than Jack does through his, then Sheila should be paid more than Jack, but that doesn't by itself tell us how big the pay gap between them should be. So meritocracy is sometimes attacked on the grounds that it licenses very large inequalities, particularly of income, but that's a mistake. Meritocracy, at least formally, remains neutral on that issue, and if there's going to be a justification, here I'm echoing something that came up in Maris's paper yesterday, if there's going to be a justification for large inequalities, it has to come from somewhere else, for example, by appeal to efficiency, or maybe to the Rawlsian difference principle, for those who know that principle, not from meritocracy itself. Now, I'm going to try to defend meritocracy against three separate critiques. So these are the three issues. The first critique challenges the claim that the advantages people receive under a meritocratic system are, in a morally relevant sense, deserved, and it focuses on how people come to possess the qualities that then count as merit, and in particular on the way in which these qualities are inherited via family membership. And so the point of the first critique is to undermine meritocracy as a conception of social justice. Second critique focuses on the idea of merit itself and claims that it's socially constructed in such a way as to benefit those who are already advantaged. In other words, there are no relevant natural properties that count as meritorious. Rather, a particular talent counts as a source of merit only because we've created institutions that require its deployment. But that institutional engineering, this is the critique, is carried out in such a way that it benefits the powerful and the wealthy and their offspring. The third critique focuses on the malign social effects of meritocracy on social solidarity. And this, in fact, goes right back to the original social satire by Michael Young, which gave us the term meritocracy. So the charge is that in a society governed by merit principles, because the better off know that they deserve their advantages, they'll be reluctant to sympathise with those worse off than themselves and to support redistributive policies. Moreover, the lifestyles of these two groups, the elite and the rest, are going to diverge in such a way that they have little social contact. So here the thought is that solidarity will actually be greater in a society in which random factors, some kind of good or bad luck, have a significant role to play in deciding people's fate. So it's kind of paradox that it might be better actually for luck to be a more prominent source of social advantage, and if everybody recognises this. Okay, I'm going to take these in order, and I'm going to start with the desert issue and the no desert critique. So now this often draws its strength from the observation that in the societies which claim already to be broadly meritocratic, advantaged social positions are to a large extent transmitted from one generation to the next. So economists spell this out in terms of correlations between the incomes of the first generation and the income level of their offspring. And I think Melanie may give us some evidence about this later on. Whereas sociologists tend to use a social class analysis and point out that the children of those belonging to the top social class in a 7-class hierarchy are 20 times as likely as people from the bottom social class to end up themselves in the top stratum. So this is a kind of ratio conception. So when these findings are used to discredit meritocracy, the implicit assumption is that in a meritocratic society, there would be no such correlations. So a street cleaner's child would be as likely as a banker's child to become a banker themselves. That's the assumption. Now, even if we accepted that assumption, of course, the raw data wouldn't tell us that meritocracy is impossible. It would just show us we haven't got there yet. But the people who produce it, the sociologists and the economists, tend to emphasize that the data is rather robust and seems to survive changes in social policy. So, for example, replacing selective schools by comprehensive schools seems not to make much difference to the extent of intergenerational transmission of advantage in the class case. But I think here before we leap to that conclusion, I think we need to pause and take stock. So accepting the evidence at face value, we need, I think, to look at the different mechanisms that might explain the observed correlations. What are parents doing for their children that explain why their children enjoy different prospects for success? And we can divide the factors into 3 groups. First, providing their offspring with material advantages, inherited wealth, superior educations, and so on and so forth, material advantages. And second, the home environment as a place of the formation of the child in their early years, a source of cultural values. And then third, the transmission of genetic factors that together may constitute natural talents of various kinds. Now, my suggestion is we need to look at those 3 kinds of factors in a very different light from a meritocratic point of view. So, factors in the first group are straightforwardly anti-meritocratic. They breach the equality of opportunity principle, my second principle, by providing favourable conditions for some that are not provided for others to develop their abilities. So if I have entrepreneurial talents and my parents give me a cool million, then I'm obviously off to an unfairly good start, and the same is true if I'm bought a superior education. So genuine meritocracy try as far as possible to limit these transmission processes in the first category. But at the other extreme, we have genetic transmission from parents to children. Now, exactly how this works and how much weight should be attached to it in explaining a child's social destination is a contested issue, partly because the abilities that form the basis of later merit can't be tracked to a particular gene, and also because of interactions between genes and the early years of a child's life in the family context. And I think, so some of the early studies here tended to focus on sort of IQ, but these I think are somewhat now discredited, mainly because intelligence of that kind, as measured by IQ tests, tends to be not to be a particularly important predictor of future success as compared to other genetically transmitted traits. But here I'm going to switch into philosophical normative mode. I think the interesting question here is whether genetically inherited abilities should be disqualified as grounds of desert. So, meritocracy's critics sometimes argue that whether somebody is genetically endowed with a particular talent is a matter of luck, and they conclude from this that they can't deserve whatever benefits accrue to exercising that talent. But that assumes something about desert, namely that a person can only deserve some outcome when they're fully responsible for all of the conditions that make that outcome possible. But that's clearly a mistake. So just take a very homely example. Supposing I deserve to be picked for the school football team. I'm a good footballer, so I deserve my place. Okay. Well, clearly I can't claim credit for the fact that the school has a football team in the first place. I wasn't responsible for that. So you could say, well, it's good luck that the school has a football team, and so I can deserve my place in it. But the desert claim nothing there upsets the claim about desert. That's a general point. More specifically, notice that there's something peculiar about the claim that it's just a matter of luck that I have the genetic talents that I was born with. Obviously, my genes make me the person that I am. Without those genes, without those specific talents, I would simply be a different person. So the question, what would DM have become if he had not had the talents he was born with, is a nonsense question. Whereas it does at least make sense to ask the question, what would become of DM if he'd been born into a different family, to a less affluent family, for example? So I think the answer is we have to treat native talents as constitutive of the person, not as adventitious features that somebody might or might not have possessed. And so the justice claim that's underlying meritocracy is that a person becomes deserving by deploying these constitutive features into practically useful skills and then using those skills to provide some valuable good or service in the society. Okay, so that's my answer to the very basic luck objection to meritocracy, the claim that meritocracy can't be fair because a person's success will depend upon, in part at least, their genetically transmitted natural talents. But now what about the role of the family? If family background, independently of genetics, partly determines how someone fares in the competition for jobs and other advantaged positions, does that destroy meritocracy? It shows it's impossible to achieve. Okay, my suggestion here is that we need to draw a line between the things that families do for children that constitute them as persons and the things that family do that can be understood as providing them with opportunities or lack of them. That's not going to be an easy line to draw. So when parents teach children one or more languages, when they introduce them to shapes and numbers, when they form their personalities by their parenting styles or by setting examples of how to behave, when they pass on cultural norms and values, all of that, religious beliefs, for example, would be one clear case, beliefs about what's important in life and what isn't, all of this is constituting their children as people of a certain kind. So that all falls on one side of the line. On the other side of the line, when they arrange for their children to attend private schools, for example, or support them through universities, when they transfer money to buy houses or via inheritance, then they're expanding opportunities in a way that breaches the equality of opportunity principle. Okay, well, somebody might say, well, okay, but doesn't the family's role in constituting the person also breach equality of opportunity, since some families do a better job of this than others in terms of equipping their offspring with capacities and cultural attributes that lead to success? Okay, what I think this shows is that, assuming for the moment that the family is not going to disappear, then a feasible conception of equality of opportunity has to apply only to the material and not to the formative role of the family. Now, some people may find that too thin a view of equality of opportunity. This is something we can discuss later on. However, I think even controlling the material aspect of family transmission would be very radical in its implications when you consider the huge material advantages that families today transfer to their offspring. Okay, so my argument is that once we understand the different ways in which the family transmits advantage through generations, then we don't have to abolish the family entirely for equality of opportunity, so long as it's understood in the right kind of way. We simply have to be able to control its ability to transmit material advantage. Okay, so move on now to the second critique, the second main charge against meritocracy, one that targets the very idea of merit that's supposed to govern access to jobs and so forth. And the claim is it's socially constructed in such a way as to benefit the already advantaged, thereby enabling them to pass on their advantages to their children and in effect create a hereditary caste of meritorious people. That's the claim. Now, to make this charge stick, the first move by the critics is to point out that there are no transhistorical standards of merit. The personal attributes that would have been seen as meritorious in a hunter-gatherer society are entirely different from the attributes we see as meritorious today. Merit criteria reflect not just the general state of technological advance, but also the specific institutions that we've created. So to use one of examples from Markowitz's book, and in this section Markowitz is my main interlocutor, the skills that define an outstanding pitcher in the game of baseball are entirely dependent on the rules and techniques of that game. If baseball had never been invented, then the ability to throw a curveball would be just like the ability to skim stones. In other words, something to impress your friends with, but not a source of large inflated salaries and status. Now, That claim about the contingency of merit is well worn, but I think it has by itself very little critical force. So what counts as merit in a particular society will depend on what people in that society have chosen to value, but so what? The person who's now a top-class baseball pitcher will have grown up knowing that millions of people are baseball fans, will pay to watch top-quality games, and so he trained hard to develop his pitching skills in that direction. So imagine his twin brother, who makes the somewhat eccentric choice to develop a speciality in long-range spear throwing, and now complains that it's only arbitrary that his talents are not given the recognition and reward that they deserve. What would we say about that person? Well, I think we wouldn't pay much attention to their complaint. So I think to cast doubt on the idea of merit, you have to do more than just point to contingency of that specific kind. You need to show that merit criteria have been constructed in such a way as to correspond to nothing of real social value. So the critics, like Markowitz and Sandel, give us a narrative that runs roughly as follows. First, merit becomes associated with the possession of academic credentials. Young people acquire specific skills in data analysis, for example, through attending school and university, especially elite universities. And the longer they remain there, the more meritorious they become, and then released onto the labour market and hired by top firms in fields like law, finance and management consulting. They're able to shape the way these firms operate so as to render indispensable the skills that they've themselves have come to possess. So, for example, the technologies that these firms use are such that they require super skilled people to operate them. And then, since they command high salaries, these high-skilled alumni of elite universities can ensure that their own offspring attend the right schools and universities, and so in due course themselves become meritorious. And this is the basic claim in the quote from Markowitz up on the slide. Now I want to pick this critique apart as far as I can, and so let me begin on this response. So, first of all, this claim that merit's merely an artifact of the elite seems not to apply to many sections of the modern economy. In particular, it doesn't apply to people who work in businesses that sell goods and services directly to customers, where the end user is the judge of the value of what's being produced. So if a baker bakes bread that is popular with foodies, or a hairdresser creates styles that customers like, there's nothing artificial about the merit that these people display. It's not to the point, always remember this, it's not to the point that in some counterfactual world, people might have preferred a different kind of bread or different hairstyles. The fact is that the suppliers, the customers know what they want, and the suppliers are giving it to them, and that seems to me a good basis for a claim to merit. It also doesn't apply to people who excel, for example, in sports or performing arts, where there's a critical public able to judge their performances. So I'm not here trying to justify the salary levels that people receive. I'm just responding to the idea that there's no such genuine thing as merit in these fields. So in the case of sporting or artistic performance, I think this is highly implausible. So the criteria of merit are at once both contingent and objective. We might not have invented the marathon race, and Puccini might never have written Tosca, but given that these things exist, then we can judge whether somebody's performed at a high level in the marathon or sung a fantastic aria in Tosca. And then finally, it doesn't, I think, also apply in scientific fields where there is, so to speak, a reality check that will eventually tell us who has merit and who doesn't. Now, you might at first sight think that the artificiality critique applies here too, since to be a top scientist, you first have to acquire the right kind of credentials by attending suitable university. Then you have to engage in approved forms of research, publish in certain journals, and so on and so forth. And this looks like a purely constructed notion of what a successful career in the sciences looks like. And you could imagine people training their offspring to become successful scientists in that sense. But although someone's ability as a scientist is undoubtedly measured according to the dominant paradigm in that field, there is still finally a reality check in the sense that either a research program yields empirically verifiable results or it doesn't. In other words, either a newly developed vaccine does prove to cure or prevent the acquisition of COVID, or else it doesn't. And either the Large Hadron Collider creates a Higgs boson for an infinitesimal speck of time, or it doesn't, and so forth. At the end of the day, there is a reality check. And I think the science example is illuminating because it helps bring out what the critics of meritocracy are claiming about their favoured cases of artificial merit. The argument isn't that the elite skills that their possessors have are entirely useless, far from it. They do contribute to delivering a product, whether that's a good or a service. The claim is that the same or an equivalent product could be delivered in other ways, and indeed was so delivered at a time when these specific skills and the accompanying technology were not available. So Markowitz, take one of his examples, uses the example of the US mortgage market for domestic housing, where in earlier times decisions about mortgage loans were made by middle-level managers who knew their customers and were able to assess them personally. And this has been replaced by a system where clients submit sort of application forms, and these are the loans are granted according to some kind of algorithm, and then the loans are sort of bundled up and securitized and sold as securities. And so instead of a whole lot of middle-level managers earning middle-level incomes, Markowitz claims what you now have are the highly paid elite who design the algorithms, and then very low-grade and low-skilled clerical workers who just process the forms. But then, okay, supposing this is what has happened, I think we do have to ask why this technological change occurred unless there was an efficiency gain from using the new system. So imagine there are two banks in competition. One uses the old-fashioned way of deciding on mortgages. The other uses the new high-tech method. You know, why would the second bank displace the first unless there was some efficiency gain, either in terms of smaller number of bad loans being made or the cost of making them, something like this? If there's no real efficiency gain, then we would have to have some bizarre explanation of the switchover, I think, unless you imagine somehow the skilled elite colluding to take over the banking system and force through structural change, or perhaps, on the other hand, some kind of irrational panic on the part of traditional bankers who think that unless they go high-tech, they're going to be forced out of the market. However, this counter-argument against Markowitz that I've tried to deploy, I think, doesn't wholly undermine the force of his critique, because he can still point out that the new forms of merit that have emerged as a result of technical change have enabled their possessors to demand huge salaries, and so fueling the rise of income inequality. So in contemporary circumstances, meritocracy acts as a source of inequality. So this brings us to the third of my critiques. Meritocracy undermines social solidarity. And I think you can divide that into two main charges. First, that people in a meritocratic society, particularly the better off, will not be willing to support redistribution in favour of the the worse off, welfare state policies and so forth. And then second, that meritocracy in contemporary circumstances leads to social polarization, with members of the meritorious elite having little contact with the rest of the citizen body, with further implications for social trust and the functioning of democracy. Now, I think this third critique is actually more telling than the other two, and my response to it is only going to be qualified. I think there are real issues here. So the claim is that if a society were indeed to become thoroughly meritocratic, its members would believe that in a quite strong sense, each person deserved the social position they occupied and the rewards that came with it. And so they would resist redistributive taxes and other policies designed to promote social equality. And even today, the argument goes, when people recognize the importance of family inheritance and other arbitrary factors in determining anyone's chances of success, they're very reluctant to redistribute what they see as legitimately acquired income. So, for example, inheritance tax meets a large degree of popular resistance. And the suggestion is this would only intensify if possessing these advantages were seen to be attributable to individual desert. And there is experimental evidence that seems to support this claim. So when people are asked about what factors they think are important for getting ahead in life, the more people attribute success to meritocratic factors like hard work and ambition, the less concerned they are about income inequality, and the less support they show for policies like progressive taxation that are designed to reduce it. However, redistribution in the form of compressing the scales of post-tax income or wealth is not the only form of redistribution, also not necessarily the best indicator of social solidarity. There's also need-based redistribution, where the aim is to provide every citizen with a set of resources, subsistence, housing, healthcare, and so on, independently of ability to pay. There's evidence to show that needs-based claims occupy a prominent position in ordinary people's thinking about distributive justice. So, for example, when asked to rate the relative importance they attached to different aspects of social justice, reducing large inequalities of income, recognizing people's merits, guaranteeing that basic needs are met, a large European sample gave strongest endorsement to the third, meeting basic needs. And even Americans, who are generally much more skeptical about the role of government in this area, agree that government should ensure that everyone has healthcare coverage, 73% in favour, that should see that no one is without food, clothing or shelter, 68% in favour, everyone who wants to work can find a job, 67% in favour. So the big question then is whether if a society becomes more purely meritocratic in the economic sphere, these pro-redistribution attitudes would continue to hold in the social sphere, or whether notions of personal responsibility, which are already present, would become increasingly strong so that people then would expect other people to use mechanisms like private insurance to cover their predicted basic needs in the future. Now, given more time, I would have more to say about this, because I think this is one of the key issues about whether a meritocratic system in the economy supported by meritocratic attitudes can coexist with a different kind of set of beliefs and attitudes and behaviours in the social sector. But I want just finally to say a few words about the other solidarity issue, the polarization issue. And I think this is the concern is well expressed by this passage from Markowitz up on the slide. Now this is making a claim about meritocracy in the US today, mainly. And I think this is true of both Sandel and Markowitz. They contrast the present day with a golden age somewhere around the middle of the last century, when their society was more egalitarian than it had ever been before. And they're willing to admit that meritocratic principles were for a long time instrumental in displacing the hierarchies that had prevailed for centuries in Europe and for a shorter amount of time in North America. So something quite specific must have happened to turn meritocracy from being a socially leveling idea to being a socially divisive one. And I think there are three factors that you find in their discussion to explain this reversal. First of all, they point to the socially divisive effects of increasing income inequality, with elite lifestyles becoming ever more divergent from those people further down the income scale. And then secondly, this is reinforced by the fact that merit now takes the form of highly mobile forms of human capital, so that its possessors are able to cluster together in particular physical environments and interact only with those who share their endowments. In other words, the idea is that a traditional employer, say a factory owner, would have physically been proximate to the workers he employed. He would sort of run into them on the streets of the city or whatever, and would have some knowledge of their life circumstances, whereas a high-skilled financial analyst today could choose to locate herself anywhere and would no doubt therefore choose a kind of sheltered enclave occupied by people like her. And then third, both Markowitz and Sandel lay heavy emphasis on educational credentials as badges of merit, which then creates a primary status division between those who went to university and those who didn't, and then secondary divisions between those who went to highly elite universities and those who went to more basic kinds of college. So, Sandel, interestingly, I think, highlights the attention now paid to smartness in political discourse and how to be labelled smart, a person needs to have the right kind of academic record, which is why you find Donald Trump making strange claims about his academic credentials. Why does he bother? Because it's become very important to present yourself as a smart person, and a smart person has degrees from elite institutions. And that contrasts with earlier ways of estimating a person's practical intelligence. So, a first response is to say, well, it's not meritocracy itself, it's not adherence to those three principles that I started with that is producing these divisive outcomes, but it's other factors that are driving income inequality and favouring a particularly narrow conception of merit and so on. But I think that's not a totally satisfying response, because a defence of meritocracy today must show that it's a feasible way of organising a society like ours, highly advanced, highly technically advanced, with a complex division of labour, and so you can't sort of counterfactualise away the forces that are producing these outcomes. In other words, it's not good enough to say meritocracy would be fine if it weren't for these other factors that are producing this and distorting the way that it works. So I think that in the end, we have to say that meritocracy is only defensible as one part of a wider conception of social justice, in particular one that also has egalitarian principles to counteract the inequality legitimizing properties of the merit principle. And I think one of its earliest defenders, the sociologist Daniel Bell, was right to speak of a well-tempered meritocracy. That was his phrase. And I think a well-tempered meritocracy is the only kind that can stand up to critical scrutiny. Thank you very much. Thank you. I should just add that this paper, there is a written version of this paper. It does have footnotes for those interested in footnotes to back up some of the claims that I make. So if anybody would like a copy, please get in touch and I'm very happy to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David Miller. I'll switch immediately now to our next speaker, Melanie Hähner. She is here at the University of Lucerne. She is at the Institute for Economic Policies in charge of social policy questions. And as mentioned before, she has done significant research on issues of justice and meritocracy here in Switzerland. We'll be curious to hear about the results of your research. Melanie, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. We're gonna ask ourselves within the next 45 minutes whether we have inequality of opportunity in Switzerland. And we're gonna answer this question by looking at the data. If we are talking about inequality or equality of opportunity in a society, and we try to assess it, then we face different opinions, judgments, but also interpretation of the results. To give you a flavor, let's look at 2 newspaper articles in Switzerland. It's either, this is how badly Switzerland is doing in terms of equal opportunities, or Switzerland lives the American dream. And we will see that this is not only a mere result of diverging opinions and judgments, but it's also very much dependent on how we measure the extent of equality of the opportunity in a society. So that's why before we head right into the data, I'm gonna talk about the definition and the measurement methods of equality of opportunity, and then especially also of social mobility. We're gonna probably discuss later on by how much social mobility is a good proxy for the equality of opportunity in a society. So what do I mean when I talk about social mobility? We already heard it in the introduction that usually it is assessed as a proxy to measure the equal right to the development of unequal assets. So it's considered as an important characteristic of equality of opportunity because it describes the permeability of a society. What you probably know, or what comes to mind first when you are hearing something about social mobility is that it is the extent to which children's social status are dependent on the one of their parents or other ancestors. But how do you define social status? That can be either education, income, wealth, occupational status, or Professor Miller mentioned it as well, even political offices. And so even from the mere fact that you can define social status based on very different aspects leads to the conclusion that you might come to different results when regarding the extent of equality of opportunity in a society. But it gets even more complicated because there is not one clear definition of social mobility because there are different kinds of social mobility. You can distinguish between intra and intergenerational social mobility. Intragenerational social mobility describes the social mobility within one generation. So it answers the question how sticky upward and downward mobility is over a life cycle. So I can give you the example of a student that works part-time as a waiter, and then after getting his degree, he works as a resident doctor, so he moves up the income ladder within a lifetime. And this is also how you can define part of the American dream, so it's from the rags to riches, so that you can really change jobs and income position within one lifetime. But when talking about the extent of equality of opportunity, you are usually referring to the inheritance across generations and not the dynamics within a generation. So it's about the intergenerational inheritance of social status. And you are answering the question, is the social status of a child dependent on the social status of the ancestors? But even within this intergenerational social mobility, you have to distinguish between absolute and relative intergenerational social mobility. Let's take the example of a post-war generation. Then, in general, children are better off than their parents were because they are not in the war generation anymore. So you could compare then the mean social status of the children's generation to the one of their parents, which would lead to conclusions about absolute social mobility. So that children of post-war generations are just better off than their parents. But does that give you a hint about equality of opportunity? Probably not, because it's more about the relative positions according to your own family. So that's why we are usually focusing on the relative intergenerational social mobility. You can imagine that when taking the metaphor of a ladder, it's not about the question whether everybody can move up one step compared to the previous generation, but it's about switching places on the ladder. So whether your own family determines your own destiny, or whether you can also change and swap places on the ladder. So this is about the definitions. Now let's head into the evidence. And before coming to the typical or specific Swiss case, we will have a look at the international evidence. And I gave you all those different definitions, and we will have the according evidence now also starting with the intragenerational social mobility and then going towards the intergenerational social mobility. So this picture from rags to riches, the extent of intragenerational social mobility is best described with some typical examples of the music industry. There are several examples, such as, for example, Kurt Cobain, born and raised in difficult family situations. He lived with his grandparents when his parents got divorced. Then he lived with 10 different families. He dropped out of school when he was 18. He was unemployed. He even lived in his car for a certain period of time. And then after, once they were successful with the band Nirvana, they accumulated a huge wealth, and he went all up the income and wealth ladder. There are other examples from the music industry, such as, for example, Elton John. But those examples do not take into account the downside of this industry. You're probably all familiar with the streaming platform Spotify, where you can have millions of different songs where you can stream. But did you know that a huge share of those songs have never been streamed so far? That's why the platform Forgotify was founded, and you can find there over 4 million different songs that have never been streamed before on Spotify. So not everybody has the same rise as Kurt Cobain showed it. And furthermore, there are also examples such as Elvis Presley that are a good example that you can go up, so from rags to riches, but then back to rags. Other examples are, for example, lottery winners, that you have a huge increase in your income and then you just blow it and then you are back on the bottom. But you see, within this life cycle, you can have huge dynamics. And there are different evidence and studies on that, especially for the US. So there is one study that I want to mention that, for example, 12% of the Americans are in the top 1% in 1 year. So that 12% actually make it once to the very top. And then only 0.6% manage to stay in the top 1% for 10 consecutive years. And approximately on the bottom, 54% live in poverty or at risk of poverty for at least 1 year within their life cycle. So you see, if we're talking about dynamics and intra-generational, but that's also true for the intergenerational perspective, then of course, then you have the dynamics towards the top, but also on the other side, towards the bottom. Another study for the millionaires show that 50% of the millionaires had their millionaire status only for 1 year, and only 6% actually remained for the entire time period. Now, switching towards the intergenerational perspective and starting with the two-generational results. Professor Miller already introduced that usually people are measuring the extent or the correlations, the relationship between the social status of the parents and their offspring. So the two-generational perspective. There was a formative analysis done by Becker and Toms, and they said that they see a very small correlation, a very low correlation of only 0.2, meaning that only 20% of the offspring's income was actually determined by the one of their parents. And they saw, or they used data from very different countries, and they said, yeah, it's always about the same, about those 20%. That's also where the proverb comes from shirt leaves to shirt leaves within 3 generations. The newer evidence shows that there is huge heterogeneity across countries. So the newest evidence shows that the lowest mobility, so the highest correlation between the social status of the parents and their offspring, is actually measured for the US, where we have 40 to 60% that are actually coming or explained by the parental status. And the highest mobility is usually measured within the Scandinavian countries. We will see later on where Switzerland stays in this comparison. But before that, I will introduce you to the very long-run perspective. And I want to mention the huge work of Gregory Clark. He and several co-authors thought that it's not a good idea to just have a look at 2 consecutive generations. Because if you want to say something about dynasties and stickiness of the elites, you have to take a long-run perspective. And of course, it's really difficult to have data on such a long time span where you can actually trace back families. So what they came up with is that they used a surname approach. They were looking at very rare surnames of high or of very low social status, and they had a look at how much they could, or for how long those respective families actually could stay at the top or had to stay at the bottom of society. And they were looking at very different societies over huge time spans, such as China, UK, the US, and Sweden. And what they came up with was very surprising and also much debated. We will probably discuss that later on as well. So they say it actually doesn't matter at what time span you're looking at or at what country. Social mobility is much lower than usually expected if you measure it as they do, and if you are looking at a long time horizon. And they say, yeah, social mobility varies little over time, and the intergenerational correlation ranges from 0.7 to 0.9. So 70 up to 90% would actually be explained by the parental social status. And they don't see any differences, or barely any differences, between different social status indicators. So they not only claim that it doesn't matter on which country you are looking at what time span, but also that it doesn't matter whether you're looking at educational mobility, income mobility, wealth mobility, or anything else. What about the evidence for Switzerland? Again, I will start with the short-term perspective. So the intragenerational social mobility. There has been conducted a study for the canton of Zurich with tax data, where they looked at the social status, or the actual place in the income distribution for the individuals in 1 year and then 10 years later on. They compared the social status of individuals and their places in the income distribution in 1 year and then 10 years later. And what they find is what is depicted in this picture. There are a lot of numbers in there. I'm just gonna mention the most important, or maybe also the most surprising ones. 28% of all households actually stayed in the same income class, whereas 72% moved within the income distribution. Maybe we can think of the example that I mentioned at the beginning. So, of course, there you have also students who worked part-time during their studies, and then once they got their degree, they were in a different income position. But students are probably not 72% of all the households. So in general, there is a lot of dynamic going on within 10 years. And I think that this is a very important aspect when we are looking at the static distribution of income within one generation, so the income inequality, because we also need to consider the dynamics that we change places within this distribution even within 10 years. And 3% moved up from the lowest to the highest decile. So most of the movements are not from the very bottom to the very top, but just within the other deciles. And what you also can see out of the colors is that the persistence is actually highest at the tails of the income distribution. So the mobility is lowest at the tails of the distribution. Now, what about the evidence on the intergenerational social mobility in Switzerland? Remember, we can measure social status and thus also social mobility according to different categories. One of them is the educational social status. And so the educational social mobility is best shown by the share that actually attain a university degree. There has been a study by the Swiss Science Council back in 2018, and they showed that on average of all the young people, 35.7% actually get a university degree. But they also show that it is unequally distributed according to their background. Only 13.5% of those stemming from low-educated households actually get the university degrees. On the other hand, for the kids stemming out of the well or highly educated household, it's a share of over 50%. So what we can conclude from that is that academics' children are largely overrepresented at Swiss universities. But that's not the end of the story, because when we take the example of Switzerland, we actually see that the extent of social mobility hugely varies according to the respective social status that we are looking at. Because there is a study from the University of St. Gallen that shows that we actually have a very high income mobility that is even higher than what we see in Scandinavian countries. According to this study, only 14% of the income of offsprings is explained by the one of their parents. Within this study, they also see that this is not what can be observed for the university degree inheritance. They measure an extent of 30% or even a little bit more when it comes to the similarity and the inheritance of university education. But how can you solve this puzzle? Because education heavily explains or influences the salary that you have afterwards. Well, what that study shows is that thanks to the dual educational system, the vocational educational training possibilities in Switzerland, you are actually able to move upwards in terms of income, even though you are not doing a university degree. We will come to the specific role of the dual educational system also in a second. But so far, the evidence, so when we are looking at two-generational relationships in Switzerland, we find different results if we are looking at the educational system, or especially at the university degrees, versus when we are looking at income mobility measures. But of course, we also want to know something about the long-term dynamics, because Professor Miller already mentioned it. If we are just looking at two-generational relationships, it's really hard to disentangle meritocratic or anti-meritocratic aspects. Because is it just a mere effect of inheritance, like talents? Is it a nurture effect? So the growing up, the care within a family? Or is it really an institutional lack of meritocracy? So that's why we thought it's a good idea to also have a look at the long-term development of social mobility in Switzerland. Because imagine that also more distant generations would have an influence on your own fate, on your own success, even though you know that you haven't had never direct contact with these ancestors. So that you just, by merely having this family name, you would actually make it to the top and stay there forever. Then of course you would have dynastic effects which would be proof of a lack of equality of opportunity. So that's why we collected a massive extent of data, and we asked ourselves, how has social mobility developed since the 1550? As Switzerland doesn't exist for that long, we just looked at a small geographic region. So we were looking at the University of Basel, and especially in general the geographic region of Basel. And we developed a new surname-based approach because compared to, or what the critiques towards Clark and co-authors was like, yeah, you find such high correlations because you are just looking at very specific families, because you are restricting yourself to rare surnames of high or very low social status. But that does not give you any hint on overall social permeability. So that's why we decided to actually include all surnames that were available. And we compared the distribution of those surnames in overall society by looking at birth and baptismal registers. And we compared it to its distribution in specific elites. The elites we defined from different perspectives. We were also looking at political elites and also some inheritance tax registers, but our primary analysis was based on the University of Basel. So we knew all students enrolled at the University of Basel since even 1490, where the University of Basel was founded, but we started our analysis only in 1550. So we compared for every family their respective representation at the University of Basel to its representation in overall society in Basel. And so thanks to that, we could actually measure for each and every family in each and every generation their degree of over or under representation in the elite. And this allowed us to measure the development of the parent-child relationship over those 15 successive generations, but also told us something about the dynastic effects, or whether there were dynastic effects in Switzerland. Starting with the development of the parent-child relationship, we see it here in those brown lines that there was an up and down, a cyclical pattern of those relationships, but overall, on average, it stayed very stable. And we were looking a little bit closer on those peaks of social persistence. So where the relationship between the parental and their offspring status was the highest. And you see that with the numbers. Those were all generations that were actually affected by crises, even wars, and difficult times. And you could see here that in those generations, the stickiness was the highest. So there, the mobility was the lowest, but thereafter it increased again, and so on and so forth. So looking just at the development of the parent-child relationship, we could see that it stayed on average quite stable, but it showed a cyclical pattern. But what was even more interesting to us when having the goal of finding dynastic effects was looking at several successive generations. And that's what we call the Buddenbrooks effect. I'm thinking of Thomas Mann's novel, The Buddenbrooks, and you can see here the subtitle of the movie is The Decline of a Family. Because what we find is that there is actually a decline of family effects and even a complete fading of the family effects within 4 successive generations. So we find that family ties in Switzerland dilute within 4 generations. The parental effect over all those successive generations, back to the medieval age, actually amounted to 40%. We find an additional grandparental effect of 20%. But we do not find any statistically significant effect of great-grandparents or further generations. And that's what we call the Buddenbrooks effect, because we say that there are no, on average, there are no dynastic effects. Maybe I can mention that as a side mark. We actually find very particular families that made it or that stayed at the very top for the entire time span, which is what we call the Dyke families, so the local Basel aristocracy. But in general, overall, when we include all surnames, all families, we find a dilution of the family ties within 4 generations. But what we also see in another study is social mobility is not only key to avoid those dynastic effects, but it also avoids the cementation of family dynasties through marriage. We analyzed the effects of marriages in Switzerland. And you might guess that this metaphor of birds of a feather flock together also holds true when it comes to marital decisions. So people tend to marry alike. And this is true in Switzerland as well. We did 2 studies on that. It's true with respect to income, with respect to educational status, and also with regard to wealth. And this has major distributional effects. So to just give you one intuition, income inequality in Switzerland would be 11% lower if people would actually mate randomly, would actually marry randomly. But this is just about the distributional impact, and that's where social mobility comes into play. Because we see here, you can even see that from the strength of the color, that people are way more likely in their own social status, in their own wealth, for example, than in their family background. So, for example, the top group is twice as likely, that's why we have this number 2 at the very right corner, are twice as likely to marry someone of the same group than if we would allocate them randomly. But this factor is only 1.3 when it comes to parental wealth. So people in Switzerland tend to marry alike, but especially with regard to their own social status. So it is more likely to marry into new than into old money. And this is also reflected in the distributional consequences that we see. And this is only possible thanks to social mobility. Because if people were at the exact same place as their parents, we would see the exact same numbers for the couples level as for the parents or the parental level. But this is not the case because we have this intergenerational social mobility. So people tend to mate so that they are similar, but they are not to the same extent similar with regard to their parental background. So social mobility also prevents the cementation of dynasties through marriage. I like to take the last few minutes to discuss the drivers of social mobility. Because research so far was really busy to disentangle those different concepts of social mobility, to disentangle intrageneration from intergenerational effects, and then also finding evidence on the long-term dynamics, for example, that I just showed you, the dynastic or not dynastic effects. But of course, people are also interested in the drivers of social mobility. And I already gave you a hint when talking about the situation in Switzerland. One driver that we find in the evidence, especially from this study from the University of St. Gallen, is about the importance of the dual educational system. Because it offers high-quality training and direct access to the labor market. So what we even find in Switzerland is that you have different, very diverse paths towards the labor market and towards gaining specific competencies that are actually demanded on the labor market. And not only that, but also there is evidence that mixed educational paths show higher or are related to higher returns than purely vocational or purely academic paths in Switzerland. And so why is this so important when we are talking about social mobility? Imagine that someone from a worse off family does not have maybe the possibility to do a full-time study without getting subsidies. because you need to earn your living if you don't get any money from your parents. And of course, you can do that by doing side jobs or when studying at the university. But what we find in Switzerland is that most people actually are more worried to just enter the labor market, and this is the same in most countries, but what the Swiss system shows is that in Switzerland you have the ideal setting that you not only have those vocational educational training where you also combine the work with school training, but also that you have very permeable educational institutions that later on you can even go to university or of applied sciences as well. So one driver is actually the importance of the educational system in general, and in Switzerland especially this dual educational system. Then another aspect is about the early childhood development. You see here in this graph the evidence from Germany, and you have the development index of the children. And you see how it evolves over up to the 15th years old children. And what this study from Germany shows is that the most disparities are actually already observed before children even enter the school system. So you have disparities in the development index from the beginning. So we will probably disentangle that and compare it to whether it's really a lack of opportunity, of equality of opportunity later on in the discussion, but this is just what the evidence shows. Another famous study comes from the US with this, regarding this topic, because it's what they call the 30 million words gap. So those researchers found that working class children at the age of about 3 to 4 had a vocabulary of 26 million words, whereas the academic children actually had a vocabulary of 45 million words. And so this is another interesting aspect of early child development. And then there is also evidence from Switzerland regarding the early childhood. There is a study that shows that there is an important aspect at which age actually the grades are separated, that when it's early on, that the children of the well-off families are actually better off than if the separation is done at the later age. So let me conclude here. Do we have an inequality of opportunity in Switzerland? When talking about social mobility, I just showed you that we really need to be careful about the definition, about what kind of social mobility are we actually talking about. What status indicator are we looking at? We have to not only have a look at two-generational mobility, but also consider long-term, potentially dynastic effects. And so I would summarize or sum up the situation in Switzerland as follows. We see that academics' children are overrepresented at universities. At the same time, we see high income mobility despite this comparatively lower educational mobility. So, dual educational system is key. And on average, if we are taking the long-term perspectives, we do not find any dynastic effects because family ties dilute within 4 generations. And not only that, but social mobility also prevents the cementation of dynasties through marriage. So I will conclude, Switzerland is actually a land of opportunity. We will discuss that later on. Thank you so much for the attention.
Good, welcome back. We're gonna have another hour just to debate. I think, I'll give it right into the audience. You can make comments, questions. We have heard two interesting talks on different aspects of meritocracy, social mobility, equal opportunity. We have the questions that we can broach here. Up to you to decide where you want to hark in. So please. There are microphones that will be given to you. There are ladies here who will hand them over to you. Please, the gentleman up there. You got to run.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Melanie, actually. With social mobility, one of the most discussed topics is the role of inheritance taxes and death taxes, particularly in the United States, where the debate was whether inheritance taxes should be raised from 50% to 100% in order to prevent dynastic succession. And I want to know what you found about the role of inheritance taxes.
Maybe I can comment on that quickly before I hand over to you. I mean, inheritance taxes have been a big topic in Europe as well. Particularly Thomas Piketty, as you probably know, has advocated them, but it has been here in the political arena in Switzerland as well, and the Swiss population actually voted on inheritance taxes above 20 million. Relatively high inheritance taxes. Right now it's a cantonal matter and there's no federal inheritance tax, and the cantons have really lowered them. So we're talking about going to high inheritance taxes from almost zero, but just for fortunes above 20 million. But against the expectations, that proposal was rejected by 70% of the population, even though 20 million is a fortune that very few people will have here in Switzerland. So it's an amazing phenomenon that inheritance taxes are unpopular if you like the population. Same thing, I saw a statistic in France by Jean Tirole that showed, and in France you would really expect people to be in favor of an inheritance tax, but his data showed no, not at all. People are against inheritance taxes if you ask them. So that's some of the data that I can give you from here. Now, maybe Melanie, and if you want to comment, David as well.
Yes, so I would encourage you that I'm not the only one talking about the inheritance taxes, because, of course, it's a very diverse and heavily debated topic. So first of all, we have to clarify whether we are talking about the equality or the inequality in outcomes or in opportunities in the process. And so when we are talking about meritocracy, we are more interested in the processes, so in the opportunities to actually move all the way up. The question is, where do we put now inheritances in this context? So is it a discussion of outcomes or of opportunities or of both? Because what is inheritance? Well, it's a kind of wealth. And wealth is accumulated income. But you can accumulate it on your own or across generations. So this is the type of wealth that is called inheritance. And so to assess the role of taxation in this context. So we can say, okay, it's important that our starting point, also from wealth perspective, does not limit us in our prospects, in our opportunities. So that's what we would probably all agree on. The question is now what inheritance plays as a role. And you mentioned it. We have in Switzerland a low inheritance tax. But when you then look at what is actually paid as total amount of inheritance taxes, in Switzerland, we're about in the middle of all countries that have higher inheritance taxes. The problem is, so you can avoid it easily. So this is another is one important aspect. So even though we can debate about the role or the goals of inheritance taxation, we also have to take into account the effects and the implementation possibilities. But I want to make a second argument in this context, because there is evidence from Sweden and Denmark that actually shows that at least in a short term, you can reduce inequality and wealth inequality by inheritances. Because yes, more affluent people or better off people tend to inherit more, but the relative effect that those inheritances have is a lower one than the ones at the bottom that start with no wealth, right? So there is evidence that some short-term effects can actually be positive from inheriting or allowing inheritances. So, and then the last point I want to make is that inheritances are also, or like inheritance or wealth is the part of the income that is saved. And if you can also save it across generations, this has an effect on investments and on overall productivity and growth of an economy that can then be used as a mass of redistribution. So I think this is the third comment or argument I want to give for the debate.
That's the value, social value, productivity, efficiency that maybe trumps the meritocracy aspect here of the inheritance tax. David, if I understood you correctly, you would maybe go halfway in the direction of Thomas Piketty with your separation of the two endowments given by families to their children. The personal one, that you wouldn't touch, but then you were talking about the material endowments, and there you would be more critical. Is that correct?
So, first of all, just to confirm, Carl, what you said about the unpopularity of inheritance tax, as I was always impressed by a deliberative study, because I thought you might think, well, people just instinctively reject it, but on consideration, when they're told about the very inegalitarian aspects of inheritance, they would change their minds when they realised that it's not everybody getting £250,000 or dollars, but huge inequalities. But it turns out that even when you present them with the facts, and when you suggest other possibilities, still very resistant. So there's a problem there. I suppose what I thought was that because of the slightly changing pattern of the lifestyle, inheritance strictly, in the sense of what you get when your parents die, comes pretty late in the life cycle. So it probably doesn't have that big an effect on opportunities in the general sense. So obviously gives you a very comfortable retirement, but it doesn't give you. Whereas I think what may be more important is transmission at a much earlier point, whether in the form of funding graduate education or allowing people to be sort of interns in the arts or whatever it might be, when there's a long period when you earn very little, and parental support may be very, very important. So it may be transmission at that sort of period between about 18 and 25 or 30 that might be this is speculation on her, might be most important. And there I think, so I've always been attracted by these proposals that if you can persuade people to accept inheritance taxes, you might be able to provide a capital grant to people at around that age that would be used either for these career-related reasons or maybe to start a small business, something of that kind. So this is a sort of proposal that's been around for a while. I think hasn't been picked up by the political leadership. I think it's overdue.
Okay, thank you. On the other hand, just sticking for a moment with the inheritance tax question, which is an important one in this context here. We saw your data about Basel, and you said, in the very top, you called them the aristocratic families of Basel. They're not. This is not nobility. It's just, rich families that did very well and kept doing very well over generations. So if you wanted to break their grip on society, you probably would want to resort to something like that, no? The question is, would we gain in our society if we broke those very rich families by government action? Or would it be much better, perhaps, to resort to voluntary restraint in the sense of giving pledge Buffett gates? So I think that's a question here. But it's really, the very, very top. And the question is whether that undercuts meritocracy in society overall.
And I would even add to that we have to know the reasons why they stayed at the top, and so that's why we have to look at different status indicators. So I was primarily looking at the educational status, and we know that the educational status that we analyzed cannot be just both. So this is a very important institutional factor, and so those I call them local aristocratic families, but of course, no, they are not it's not a nobility class. But what we saw when we really went to their family history is that they had to reinvent themselves all the time because they
Which speaks for them.
Exactly. So they had to stay innovative to actually keep their positions. So they started with the clothes trading. Then they had some chemistry knowledge because of the coloring of the clothes. And then they started in the chemistry and pharmaceutical sector. So why did they have to, they needed to stay innovative is because there was also geographic mobility, and there were a lot of very capable people that also came to Basel that was really competing with those local aristocratic, or how you want to call it, families.
Thank you. Other question, comment? Yes. Our French colleague, Monsieur Professor Lano.
Thank you. I was listening to your different talks, and at some point I had this question, like, what is really the difference that you are making between democracy, not democracy, meritocracy, and actually just the market system? Because at many levels, isn't it possible to consider that all the criticism that we're applying to meritocracy are actually criticism we could address to the market system? And for exactly the same reason, it's possible to say that the system is not perfect, but in a way it is the best that we have right now. Because, so that's the first question. And the second question, don't you think that there is a possibility to defend meritocracy by saying simply any alternative would generate tons of issues? And I'm thinking, for example, about the ability of rent seeking. That will be extremely, extremely important. Because each and every time you are defending it by saying, look, it's providing good results. Isn't it possible to defend it by saying, look, it's not possible to do better? Thank you.
Did you want to answer that question or have another question? Okay. Anybody here to answer his question or comment?
I'll try, though I think you might need to restate it. So was the question whether, was it an efficiency question, whether we can do better on efficiency grounds, or So we haven't talked about this, but obviously meritocracies can be justified in efficiency terms because you're getting the right people into the jobs and so on. It should work better from that point of view. I mean, in my talk, I was assuming that we also needed a justice defense, that we needed to show that it could be a just system. And so that was the way I was assessing it, and assuming that critics were challenging it as a conception of, or at least a part conception of social justice. But was it the efficiency aspect that you were thinking?
No, it was not necessarily the justice aspect. In a way, indeed, merits could be understood in plenty of different ways. So, like in a market, what is a good product could be understood in very different ways. And you're just saying, as long as your position will depend on what you are doing and not the position, I don't know, the job of your parents, your political connection, and all the things, then we can consider that, yeah, the market is meritocratic by definition.
It seems to me that's very much the argument you made, you know. I mean, we have markets, we have consumers, and, you know, they basically ask for what happens.
But then what is the difference between meritocracy and a market system?
Well, I mean, that's not quite right, is it? Because although our market system is of that kind, I mean, you could have a market system which control to various trades was hereditary. You could have a kind of a sort of inherited guild system where only the children of bakers could become bakers, and you could still have a market. So it's more than just the market system. It's also a question of who gets access to positions within the market system, whether these are just like individual traders or bosses of corporations. So it's got that other aspect too. So it's by no means inconsistent with the market, but it also places constraints on it. So a meritocratic market system must have built in various kinds of checks and rules to prevent, various forms of nepotism or discrimination, for example, because it's not obvious that markets left to themselves will always avoid discriminatory outcomes.
But I think that goes back to the market imperfection issues that we always deal with, you know, equal opportunity as a prerequisite of functioning markets. But I mean, you're absolutely right. The big question is, you know, once we start tinkering with all this, are we perhaps destroying more than we are saving? And then we're back, you know, at the freedom issues, things like that. I mean, it's a weighing of interests, and, you know, it's speculating about the effects.
Yes, but I think like there's one more aspect which comes when we are talking about the meritocracy and how we define it, because how can we combine meritocracy and its aspects with democratic elements? So I think this is where it goes like one step further than just the market-related pros and cons, like efficiency and the need for a distribution. So because for example, Sandel, in his critique says, yeah, it's the problem that once you know that by effort and natural talent you make it to the top, you could end up in a kind of expertocracy, right? So that we always have just a small, very capable, how to define it, elite that decides overall. And so that's why I came to you with this suggestion. So that's why I think like the Swiss case is again a good example, because we have a lot of direct democratic aspects. So we have the popular votes and we have a militant parliament. And I think like combining this with meritocratic institution is a good way of counterbalancing different pros and cons of meritocracy.
Yes. I think part of the question, sorry I don't have a microphone, but part of the question. Can you hand him the microphone? Well, why don't you wait? I think it's easier if you just... It was just an alternative. Sorry. Thank you.
An alternative is luck. So let's just put luck into it, right? I think this is what you get to, and why luck wouldn't work. You would say, hey, let's just draw, straws when we were born, and then you arrive at a certain position. That's an alternative that doesn't work, and that's why, merit is what we're, basing it on. I was just following up on the question.
Okay. Yes, Klaus.
Yes, I would like to continue with this word luck. It's the first criticism that you discuss, and I'm not quite sure if luck is not much more important, not just the family and natural talents and home environment. Regis Lano mentioned the market system, and also in the market system, often it is luck that energy prices, for example, the scarcity changes very quickly, and then you have higher profits or higher wages, also in the job market. So I must say that in my life I had a lot of luck, so I'm very happy about that. But so luck can play an important role, and I'm not quite sure, is it in harmony or not? Undermines it? Does it undermine a meritocratic system? Also, when you get a job, often it is luck that you're the right person at the right place, the right time. So that's my question. What the role of luck? Is it then in harmony, or does it undermine a meritocratic system? To David Miller.
Yes, it's a great question, and it's a really hard one. Insofar as I have any response to it, it's that what matters is that luck shouldn't accumulate. In other words, individual episodes of luck, I think, have to be accepted and don't in themselves disturb meritocracy. What does disturb it is if luck, as it were, opens a whole set of opportunities and closes off a whole set of others in such a way that your life thereafter is largely determined by this lucky occurrence at a particular point in time. So it doesn't matter that, think about, an athlete who on various race days, sometimes the conditions are good, sometimes they're bad, sometimes the athlete's in full bodily strength, sometimes they have some kind of injury. So individual results will fluctuate, and that I think isn't important. But what would disturb the sort of meritocratic thing is if some early event completely determined the career of the athlete. So I think it really depends on the role that luck plays in the. You're absolutely right to ask the question, and as you can see, I think it's for a defender of meritocracy, it's one of the key questions that has to be answered. What kind of role of luck is acceptable in a meritocracy, and where do we want to try to exclude it?
It appears to me that luck has a high acceptance in our societies. I'm always struck by those lottery wins, which are now going into the hundreds of millions, and nobody thinks this is unjust. There even has been a 1 billion lottery win, I think, somewhere at some stage, and nobody, complains about the lack of meritocracy in connection therewith, whereas management salaries, which are much lower than lottery wins, are much more critically looked at. So it appears to me that people are willing to accept a certain degree of luck, but they're not willing to accept things like management salaries or gender gaps, where they really feel equal treatment, equal opportunity has been violated. And then the question will be, why has it been violated in those circumstances? But there seems to be a separation here among people in general.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Can I just comment on that? You're absolutely right, and it's curious, but I think that people have a certain view about what a lottery does. Mm-hmm. So you win the lottery, and maybe you buy a nice house and have lots of nice holidays, and you give away a lot of money. But imagine a world in which the corporate ownership was decided by lottery. So if you won the lottery, you become a corporate owner. I think people would find that far more problematic, and that's precisely because it would lock in luck going ahead and put you in a position of advantage that extends over time and also determines your relationship to other people. So I think, again, it comes back to the role that luck plays in terms of future trajectories. Sorry.
No, absolutely, I agree. So I would add two things. First, it's about the question of randomness, right, and uncertainty. Maybe everybody hopes to get one day the big shot on the lottery. And then there's this second aspect. It might also help to actually install meritocratic aspect. So at the University of Basel, there was one time period where professors were just staying within the same families. And so what they did is they installed kind of a lottery. So they decided on which is a good pool of more or less equivalent people and equivalently capable professors or potential professors, and then they just relied on the lottery to actually decide who should be the successful one. So maybe to one point, luck can even be also a very key element of meritocracy.
Our Italian colleague, yes.
Thank you very much. I have a question that regards the relationship between capital and labor and meritocracy, not in terms of intergenerational relationship, but in the same generation. So what interests me is to understand whether, in your views, the same principles that we apply to labor from a meritocracy perspective would apply also to return over capital. So not the defense of capital as the fruit of labor, but the situations in which new capital is the result of the investment of actual capital. To what extent the same principles that we apply to labor can straightforwardly be applied also to this kind of wealth generation and accumulation, or not?
You're asking whether we should do that or whether we are doing it?
It's a normative question, yes.
A normative question, right, yeah. I mean, let me first, that's a big discussion also here in Switzerland and elsewhere. I mean, in the United States, the taxation of capital, it goes very much into that. Labor is relatively highly taxed, consistently taxed, and the criticism is that this is not true for capital. Wealth tax, the wealth tax in the United States is one of the big issues, has been discussed and tried in other countries too. By the way, it has been applied over the last decades in Switzerland. Switzerland has a wealth tax, but here it has two elements which perhaps don't exist elsewhere. First of all, it's a cantonal tax, and so the cantons compete, so it's not overly high, at least in some cantons. In others, it is, but very wealthy people can then move to cantons where they're not being taxed too highly, but they're still being taxed. As was said this morning, the wealthy people really and the high-income people, they really make up a good part of our overall taxation income. But federalism, tax competition is one aspect here with regard to the wealth tax, and the wealth tax is also, to a certain extent, a compensation for the lack of a capital gains tax. Switzerland has 0 capital gains taxes for individuals. And, particularly if you're very wealthy, the biggest increase in wealth comes from capital gains. And so the wealth tax, in a way, compensates that and is, to a certain extent, the political compromise that has been struck here in Switzerland. But the discussion is ongoing because, as elsewhere, you could argue there is a disparity between taxing labor income and taxing capital income.
Yes, but maybe if I can just add to that also, because I think it's very relevant, because that's what I argued, yeah, okay, wealth and inheritance, and it's a stock measure, whereas capital income is also a flow, such as labor income and wages. And so capital income is considered the same in the taxation in Switzerland as labor income, but not the capital gains, as you just mentioned. But I think like the share of overall income generated in a society and its division in capital and labor income is very important, because I think what we would like to, from a meritocratic perspective, we would like to avoid kind of a feudalism, people that are just living only from their capital income, right? So that's not about the stock measure of wealth, but rather also the other flow measure, the capital income. And so what we do is we also analyze this development of the share, and at least for Switzerland, I have the evidence that it's over the last decades, it still remained stable at 70% labor income and 30% capital income. And I think this is a very relevant measure to observe, so that because from a meritocratic perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that meritocracy itself doesn't say anything about the structure of the firm. So you could have a capitalist firm that's meritocratic. You could also have a cooperative firm where the owners were the workers. And meritocracy itself doesn't distinguish between those, so the choice between them would be on some other ground. Personally, I would favour the cooperative form, partly because I think the income differentials would likely be smaller there. But a purely meritocratic capitalism would be one where everybody had to raise capital for themselves on capital markets. In other words, it wasn't inherited. So I don't think meritocracy doesn't settle that issue. I think the form of the firm and whether it separates labour and capital will be decided on other grounds, grounds of equality, but also maybe efficiency, not on meritocracy itself.
Okay, Professor Johnson and then Professor Engels.
So I'm kind of fascinated by what's not in the debate so far. Like at almost any other point in history, if we had this conversation about the role of merit in justifying whatever else, there would be like a strong religious overtone here, right? So the role of merit in salvation and something is like a highly disputed thing, but the role of like religion in society and cultural development is pretty well known and well understood. And I'm kind of wondering, to what extent is this a rehash of a debate between kind of a Protestant and a Catholic view of the way things are organized, right? So if your view is that like there is an overarching institution that will dispense like equal salvation upon all of you, then you have one particular view of the world. But if your view of the world is that I have to demonstrate that I am forgiven and I'm one of the people who has been elected and therefore I do these things, then I have an incentive to demonstrate through my merit this way. So this is like, this feels to me like a very old conversation, a very old debate that was had for a very long time. But it was had in a time when people actually had a shared set of values over what they thought merit was and what they thought the good life was and everything else. And in some sense, I worry that the conversation has actually become harder to understand, harder to actually achieve anything or reach a point, because now we don't have any of those shared values. We don't have any shared view of merit. We don't have any idea of what we're trying to progress towards. And so I just wonder, to what extent is the fact that religion has never entered into this conversation, is that an advance or is that actually a step back?
Good question. So I think the contemporary idea of merit is not a kind of moralized one in the way that, so if you look back, merit was often associated with various kinds of moral virtues, self-discipline, just morally behaving in a certain kind of way. Whereas I think a contemporary one has to reflect the diversity of social values in the sense that it responds to all of the outcomes that a society values, and it has to be some sort of composite of that. So you can become meritorious by, selling products in the market or by performing in athletics or whatever it might be. There was a kind of whole variety of things that we would count as merit. So I think, but I'm not convinced that, so some people think that Carl, you mentioned Hayek. We haven't talked about Hayek, but one of Hayek's objections to meritocracy was that in a kind of pluralistic society, there can be no shared standards of merit that apply to all. But I don't see that as such a big problem. I don't see why it's a problem if in different fields, merit takes on a different specific form, so long as within those fields, there is some degree of consensus about what it amounts to. So I think it can survive the transition from a religiously monolithic society to one where there's more pluralism in cultural values.
Professor Engels?
I wonder what is the status of the argument. I heard it in my language. We are interested in the in allocations resulting from merit and whether we think they are legitimate. I would argue that's a legitimate question, but why do we ask it? Usually with the intention of institutional design. And if that's what we are after, then there is competitors, like willingness to pay, status, equality, luck, you can go on. Are you implicitly having a winner-take-all perspective? So merit outperforms them all, therefore, if we are into design, we should forget about all the others and we should focus on merit. If you were to say that openly, I guess everybody is against you. So probably we have to balance out merit against its competitors. And I think this is where the real theoretical work should focus. How can we do that balancing? And one piece of evidence from my behavioral angle, because what you talk about is at least related to the behavioral work on fairness. And the one finding that's absolutely robust is everybody thinks the outcome is fair, that is good for him. So if you don't have a lot of money, you believe in equality. If you are strong, you believe in ability. If you come from a noble family, you believe in status. And interestingly, nobody even thinking about anything else than the one that's good for him or her.
Yes, some interesting thesis. So maybe there's no hope for finding a consensus here. On the other hand, we also have empirical data on the importance of merit.
So if you look at the studies which ask people how they, what they think about justice in their society, then the principle of merit or of getting ahead on the basis of hard work and achievement is very widely shared, and the differences emerge more when you ask people whether that is already the case. So there you do get the phenomenon you're describing, that better off people think society is already very largely meritocratic, whereas people who are worse off tend to think that it's not, but it should be. So the principle is shared, but the application is disputed. But that's, speaks in favor. If what we're in the business of doing is constructing a social ideal which would get widespread consent, that speaks in favor of it. But I think you're also right that you have to ask about how people balance the merit principle against other principles. And I was sort of hinting at that at the end of the talk when I said that I thought people could separate spheres in which the merit principle should operate from other spheres in which it shouldn't. And I think it's that delicate balancing that's going to be the key, whether you can simultaneously have a society where merit principles are the ruling sort of guide to the economic sector and other sectors, while at the same time having a social sector where other different kind of principle. Equality and need principles apply. And, the question is, can people maintain that kind of separation? And empirically, unfortunately, it's not quite so clear that they do think, for example, that how people have performed should affect things like access to medical care, where you might think access to medical care should be entirely need-driven. But actually, people do think that it's legitimate to some extent for merit-type considerations to apply there too, which is from my point of view, kind of unfortunate.
But don't we need to just have a broadly defined meritocracy so that we reward different talents? So I think like that's one perspective of how we can achieve kind of a consent on how we design our meritocracy. So you mentioned the strong ones and the bright ones or whatever. So for example, yeah, maybe footballers and top managers or whatever are also gaining high salaries. So that you have like a broad definition. But of course, that's maybe also what Markowitz mentioned when he said, yeah, at least the meritocracy had the advantage that at least the top ones could enjoy their positions, because nowadays the top ones, if you're in a meritocratic perspective, you always need to give in some effort. So because you mentioned, yeah, the ones that are just born the way they are, of course they are the ones without any luck in this meritocratic society. But I think as long as you don't reward this, just the family status, but you have a broader concept of meritocracy, then you find a consent in a society.
Yes, there was, yes, please, you're the next, yeah.
Thanks. Professor Miller, I really, excuse me, sorry. Professor Miller, I really appreciated your point just now, because I was thinking about the separating philosophical spheres and attempt, especially with regard to the distribution of esteem. If the idea that undergirds a more just meritocracy is that we're supposed to have meritocratic reasoning in, for example, an economic sphere, and a different way of valuing people in perhaps the social sphere, I was wondering whether the validity of this point stands or falls on its practicality, because as you were saying, it's often quite difficult to get people to think reliably in this way. Especially, I want to draw on behavioral economics here a little bit, because there's research that indicates that once we establish durable norms after doing lots of activity in the same sphere with the same set of norms, especially for something like meritocracy, where you can go through a system where you'll start in an academic selection process when you're quite young that continues into an employment selection process until you're for decades on end. That could be a large chunk of your life that is subject to the same economic selection processes and competitive norms for a long time. If research indicates that this mode of thinking, especially if you do it routinely, can spill over into other ways of valuing people, perhaps in the social sphere, the familial sphere, how does this affect the idea that meritocracy depends on precisely the division of how we value people in an economic or a social sphere?
David?
Yes, I mean, I'm afraid you've just asked the right question. I mean, and I don't have a direct answer. I do want to pick up something Melanie said earlier when she introduced the relation between meritocracy and democracy, because clearly democracy is one counterweight in the sense that it operates according to an equality norm. At least notionally, it's supposed to be a system of equal influence. And the question might be whether an enhanced democratic system where people engage more as like citizens on an equal basis would be some sort of counterweight to this meritocratic inequality of esteem. So it's obviously, I mean, I think when you look at critics like Markowitz, one of the things also they're pointing to is the way in which politics also becomes meritocratic in the sense that access to high political office is governed by educational and other access as well. So the hierarchies begin to sort of converge in a certain kind of way. Whereas in the past, I mean, politics was a sphere where people from all walks of life could actually get access as representatives because it was differently structured. So, you know, I think I'm a fan of direct democratic institutions, partly because I think it's one forum where people do relate to one another in terms of equality, and that might be a partial answer.
Yes, on the back.
This question is about your finding that there's not a dynastic effect. So I just want to get it's sort of a clarifying question. So that finding is surprising to me. It sort of goes against my priors. And I think it's optimistic. If there's not a dynastic effect, we can be more optimistic about intergenerational mobility. The question I have is on the collinearity of those variables. So I assume you did some regression. You have great-grandparents, grandparents, parents. And if the theory is there's a dynastic effect, so it goes from great-grandpa to grandpa to parent or grandparent. So the way that's going to be affected is through those variables. So there's going to be a lot of collinearity there. So I guess the question to you is just, I would be more convinced if you sort of dropped the parent and grandparent variables and just looked at the great-grandparent variables, or something like orthogonalized. So just how did you do that?
Yeah, that's a very important question in all multi-generational analysis. So because that's what has been done so far, like previously it started with that you just looked at the two generational coefficients and then you kind of assumed an autoregressive process, so that you just have the square of the effect of the parents that actually is the parental or is equivalent to the grandparental effect, right? But you cannot just assume that, because we show that it's actually not behaving in this manner. So that's why you need to test it. And so, of course, if you take into account every successive generation, you have the problem with multicollinearity. We tested that. It's you can test it empirically, and then it's not a problem, but there is collinearity for sure. But if you drop the intermediate generation, then you end up with an omitted variable bias, because most of the grandparental influence actually goes through the parents, right? So that's why what we did is we did this multi-generational approach, and we also compared the two generational effects, so like the correlation between the offspring and their grandparents, and compared it or assessed it with the reference point of what the autoregressive process would actually assume. And what we find is that the grandparental effect, if you directly look at the relationship between the offspring and the grandparents, it is stickier than what we would assume from this pure autoregressive AR1 process, right? But then it's important to have a look at the more distant generations, and we did that up to the 15th generation, and then we find that it actually dilutes way more quickly. So it really seems to be the case that the more closer family members like transmit more of their, not only the genes, but also like all the nurture effect that Professor Miller as well mentioned. So like those direct contacts seem to be way more important than just what we would assume from the genetic decay across more distant family members. Does that answer the question?
For purposes now, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Please, yes.
Thank you very much. So my question relates to meritocracy being on the road to being a well-tempered meritocracy. And I want to ask, or I was wondering from the policy perspective, what would be the main switches or tools with which we could regulate this balance between the values intention with meritocracy?
So I didn't hear that. Could you speak
yes.
a bit louder? Yeah.
Okay, again, so the question.
Just reformulate the question now.
Okay, so the word balance was mentioned before, and as the balance between the values intention or inequality aversion, you mentioned the support for progressive taxation versus meritocracy. How could that be regulated or be controlled? How could we approach a well-tempered meritocracy in the way you mentioned it? From the policy perspective, if that's not too distant an outlook or to an external question.
Right. Okay. Okay, there's a question about the institutions. What kind of institutional structure would a well-tempered meritocracy have? Is that it, or?
Yeah.
So the broad answer is allow meritocratic principles to determine the distribution of some advantages, maybe income in general, but don't let income then determine your access to all other advantages. So, in other words, insulate access to spheres like healthcare and so on, and education from money. But I wasn't sure whether that was okay. That's the institution, or there's another question about how to sort of solidify people's thinking about social justice in such a way that they also endorse that. So the worry, which I was trying to sort of hint at the end, was that, so we might think that support for redistributive policies depends upon people having a sense of shared fate with other people. And I think there's some evidence for that. You can sort of do experimental manipulations that sort of push people into it. They create, in an experimental setting, the sense that we are sharing a fate with other people. And that then increases people's willingness to redistribute when they're presented with evidence about need. So one of the challenges of meritocracy, or the way that meritocracy is developing, if in fact the sort of Markowitz type, Sandel type stories are true, is that if people are increasingly becoming socially isolated from each other by these status divisions, this kind of sense of shared fate may diminish, and that would then make people less willing to support redistributive measures to people in need. So that's the worry. That's on the sort of attitudinal level, that's the concern.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for your both presentations. I just have a short question, which was touched a little bit upon.
Yeah, you probably turned it off.
I'm sorry.
No? Okay. You killed it. Battery.
Thank you. So the relationship between the political systems and meritocracy, and I'm especially sort of interested in the difference between the monarchies and parliamentary democracies, and whether or not, for example, whether the argument could be made that, for example, in European monarchies, which is, of course, does not have de facto or de jure power, but nevertheless has influence, social influence, cultural influences, can actually be an obstacle for a meritocracy as compared to, for example, parliamentary democracies? Or it just isn't the case? Or in other words, whether there is a political system that is the best for the meritocracy?
Okay, so you're asking whether people that are living in a monarchy have a different attitude towards meritocracy than people who have been living in a democratic society. Do we have data on that? Let me just add one thing. I've seen data. First of all, that data showed, it's by a German gentleman, I think Mais is his name, that meritocracy is a deeply ingrained concept to some extent everywhere across societies. But he showed a clear difference between the former communist countries in Europe and the Western countries. Clearly, meritocracy is considered much more a justice principle in our Western European societies, whereas in Eastern European societies, the data showed much less confidence in meritocracy as a justice principle. Now, that might well have to do with the fact that their experience has been bad, and that's why they don't believe it's being implemented. So it's the second point up there. If they thought that it were or could be implemented, maybe they would nevertheless consider it a justice concept in the same way as we do. That's a differentiation I saw. I've not seen anything on monarchies, but maybe somebody else here.
I haven't either. I mean, my hunch is that, particularly in the Scandinavian-style monarchies, people just regard the monarchy as something quite separate. They don't really relate it to the way the society as a whole works. And yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, but I would just, my hunch would be that meritocratic values are most firmly entrenched in those societies, Scandinavian democracies, which also, as it happens, are monarchies, but very low-key monarchies. I think the UK might be different, but that's partly because we also have an aristocracy in the form of a House of Lords still with a large inherited element. I think that might have more of an effect than the monarchy itself on general social attitudes.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, gentleman behind.
Yeah, thank you very much for your speeches. I want to ask a question about the connection between meritocracy and economic growth, because for me it seems that it's also that meritocracy is also dependent on a high level of economic growth. So in the beginning of meritocracy, let's say in the 18th century, you had a connection between higher efficiency and more social justice because, for example, the military was open for a broader people who could get into the jobs, right? When Napoleon was an outsider and got up the ladder and was then one of the biggest emperors of Europe, and he opened up the competition in the military. But then you had the industrialization and capitalism, and there you have high economic growth rates, and then you need more skilled people, right? And you need new people in high positions. So then it's easy to have meritocracy, right? Because you need all these people. But what do we do if we have economic stagnation and the growth rates goes down? Then and we have more educated people now. So all these high-skilled people are competing on the same high-valued positions, and they can't get them all. So if you have the thought experiment, okay, if we have stagnation and we have only 10 high positions, but we have 100 very skilled people, then it's not obvious how you get to a just share of it. That would be my question. Yeah.
Okay, you probably could argue those people who went to university and got a high education without economic need being around, they just invested the wrong way. So you could argue it's meritocratic. Any other views on that?
I mean, I don't think meritocracy depends on economic growth. You're saying without it, it becomes more problematic, yeah. But isn't that again, so one of the things I was arguing in relation so one of the critiques by Sandel and Markowitz is that merit becomes defined in terms of these academic credentials, and then you get the kind of problem that you're pointing to, which is that people have the academic credentials and then they have expectations about where these lead. And in a zero growth or slow growth system, there may not be the expand. It comes back to the absolute and relative mobility issue. It's easier where you have expanding high positions, but it doesn't negate meritocracy, because you presumably can still make finer distinctions between the people who have university degrees. I mean, one of the interesting, sorry, it's a slight segue, but one of the interesting questions I think was in relation to Switzerland was, so some of the pathologies that are being diagnosed by these American commentators relate to the fact that higher education is becoming increasingly segmented into elite universities and so on, and others. And I was wondering whether the same process is occurring here, or whether, in fact, it's a more egalitarian university system, which would actually then prevent some of these pathologies from taking place.
Yeah, right. So indeed, so there is also, that's what I showed you, that children from academic households are more likely to attend university. But I think like the most important difference is the rewards you get out of that degree. And if you have like a permeable educational system that you can either gain like comparably valuable talents and formation in another way of like this vocational educational training that is also forming the needed labor force, or you can later on enter university. And I think like what is the most important difference then in the consequences is that it is not a necessity that you went to a certain type of university to get this high-paid jobs or the political position or anything that is related. So I think we don't have this high relationship between a university degree and other aspects of success.
And it also doesn't really matter which university you attended here. I mean, we don't really have that hierarchy among universities. That's just not the Swiss tradition. I think it's also similar in Germany, so much less of a hierarchy among universities than you have in the Anglo-Saxon world. But so in other words, you could say all universities are elite, but we have another dual-track approach which mitigates the effects of the university system overall.
Absolutely, except for University of Lucerne, for sure.
Yes. We have maybe time for one or two questions, if there are still any out there, or comments that people would like to make. Yes?
Yeah, hello. The discussion on meritocracy was a very interesting one coming from an Indian perspective, because over there the word is extremely politically charged. But not going into depths of that, of course. You discussed balancing meritocracy with other aspects such as social cohesion in order for it to be successful, and of course differentiating between different norms as well. In India, we have affirmative action in forms of quotas because, of course, there's the caste system, there's gender divisions, there's disabilities, there's also economically weaker sections that have access to this affirmative action to a great extent, and this is in the sphere of education, bureaucracy, politics, for which there is no real differentiation per se. Everything is interconnected to the point that you can't differentiate it in a practical sense. So my question in terms of the balancing is, would such a system be antithetical to meritocracy? Or according to you, this is a valid way of balancing meritocracy with other social elements and eventually leading to a success of your model?
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between meritocracy and affirmative action is quite complex, I think. In other words, there are certain forms of affirmative action that are basically counteracting inequalities of opportunity, and they would be meritocratic. Other forms, if they're, so some forms of affirmative action have a different objective, which is to create a certain particular kind of mixture of maybe ethnic groups or racial groups or gender groups within an institution. Those, I think, are more problematic. And some forms of affirmative action, I think, are intended to be compensatory for historic injustices. And again, that would be more at odds with meritocracy, which is a kind of forward-looking. It's sort of, it's not concerned with rectifying the past. That's a separate, I think, question. But for forms of affirmative action, which basically are trying to identify real potential in people that may be obscured by conventional, for example, academic grades or whatever. Those forms of affirmative action are entirely in tune with meritocracy. So I guess it depends on how that system you've described is understood in that context. Yeah.
I guess the categorization, of groups along the discrimination line is very important. I mean, going back to our discussion, is a very wealthy lady discriminate against a poor gentleman when it comes to board memberships, for instance. So you're really getting into hot waters once you start to categorize, and sometimes you have to do it. I mean, I see the Indian background. I also respect the issues that we have in our societies, but it's a tricky thing to do once you start with that affirmative action approach and start categorize people along certain lines and not others.
And I really liked your argument about the potential, because I think what we, for example, in the educational sector, we want to avoid the so-called lost Einsteins, right? That would really perform perfectly in academia, for example, or in general in the educational system, but are just restricted to enter, right? But the question is, and I mean, this is a critique on all this empirical stuff that I also do, is we can just measure the realized extent of equality of opportunity, but not the potential. And maybe this is a philosophical question. We are not forced to do every possible thing that we could with our potential, right? So it's still a free choice whether you want to realize our potential. But I think this is or how would you try to assess the potential equality of opportunity?
Yes. So let's then just end with a question. Potential equality of opportunity, a new term that was coined right here, at least for me, but maybe not for you. Thank you very much, particularly to the panel participants, but also to the audience for your active involvement. And I think with that, we end this morning's session, and I hand back to Klaus.
And also the speakers for their inspiring presentations, and the audience for the very good questions. And just the last word from a land economics perspective, because this is a land economics conference. I'm sure that we could learn that institutions matter, especially the education system, as Melanie Henner showed impressively, is very important, and the Swiss system with the dual education. And so also the University of Lucerne with our slogan, Dein Talent hat Zukunft. So we say, if you study at the University of Lucerne, you will have a bright future. And I hope that will be true and not a fairy tale. Thank you very much for coming and enjoy the apéro dish.